Good morning, everybody. You're very welcome to the first set of summary results from Census 2022. This is the first set of results to be released from the census, which took place in April of last year. I think this publication is probably best described as an executive summary or the high-level findings from the census last year. We're still analysing and working through the data that was collected, so there will be 8 more detailed publications to follow throughout the rest of this year. This press conference is taking place in a hybrid format. We have some people here with us in the room in CSO Rathmines, and most people are joining us virtually on Teams. I'd like to ask the people who are joining us on Teams to please mute your microphone and turn off your camera until after the presentation. Before we begin, the CSO would like to thank the public for their hugely positive response to the census last year, which has enabled us to produce the detailed and comprehensive results that we are presenting today. I would also like to thank the many thousands of people who worked the length and breadth of the country as part of the census field operation last year, and CSO colleagues in the 3 locations in Dublin and Cork on what is an enormously complex project. Representing the CSO today is myself, Cormac Halpin. I'm the Senior Statistician responsible for census outputs. I'm joined by my colleagues Sheila Bonham and Brendan Murphy, who are statisticians in the Census Division and will present the main results, and also my colleague Owen Flaherty, who will answer any questions that we may have as Gaeilge. I'd also like to introduce our ISL interpreters, Margaret and Michael. We'll run through the presentation in its entirety before taking questions. We'll first of all take any questions that might arise here on the floor in Rathmines. If there are questions then from the Teams attendees, you might add them to the chat and we'll get back to them. If you'd like to ask a question verbally on Teams, please raise your hand and we'll give you the floor at that point. So just before we begin the presentation of the results, to give you some contextual background. So Census Night was the 3rd of April last year. That was 6 years since the previous census. As you may be aware, the census was due to take place in 2021, but following the challenges associated with the COVID pandemic had to be postponed for 1 year. The CSO employed over 5,600 field staff to assist us in the delivery and the collection of the census forms. We conducted a 10-week field operation, 5 weeks delivering the forms and 5 weeks collecting the forms between March and May of last year. We produced preliminary figures in June of last year. Those figures are now superseded by the official results, which we begin publishing today. After we received the forms back into our headquarters in Swords, we began processing the forms between May and last year and February of this year. Essentially, that's scanning the individual forms and capturing the handwritten data to allow us to generate these results today. As I mentioned, we will be producing detailed thematic publications throughout the rest of this year, and all data and the summary publication which we're releasing today is now available on our website, cso.ie. So with that, I'll hand over to Sheila to begin the presentation of the results.
Thank you, Cormac. In this section, we will look at changes in the population, both for this census and over time. I will present data on household size and marital status, and look at some of the data available in the area of health, disability, caring and volunteering. I'll then look at some areas from the Migration and Diversity chapter. On Census Night, Sunday the 3rd of April 2022, there were 5.15 million people in the state. This is the first time that our population has increased to over 5 million since the time of the famine. This is an increase of almost 390,000 people since the previous census in 2016, which represents an 8% increase in the population since that time. When averaged out over the 6-year period, this represents an average yearly increase of 1.3% in each year. In the previous census period, 2011 to 2016, the total growth was 4%, which was an annual average increase of 0.7%. In the graph here, which shows data from 1841 to 2022, we can see our trend in our population growth during this time. After a continued decline from 1841, the population reached its lowest level in 1961 at just 2.8 million. Since then, it began to increase, and in 2022 is 83% higher than that time in 1961. The population increase of almost 390,000 people is driven from 2 elements. Natural increase, which is made of our births minus our deaths, and the estimate for net migration, which is the difference between this increase and the natural increase. In the figure here, natural increase is depicted in blue, and net migration in green. For the population growth in the years 2016 to 2022, we can see that net migration is greater than the natural increase, indicating that the population growth during this time was driven by net migration. This is different to the two previous censuses, where natural increases were the main driver of the population increases. Looking now at county population changes and average age. The population in every county increased between 2016 and 2022. Increases in the population ranged between 5% in Donegal, Kilkenny and Tipperary to 14% in Longford. Population growth tended to be stronger in the east of the country, with Meath growing by 13%, followed by Fingal at 12% and Kildare at 11%. Looking at average age, the average age of the population increased from 37.4 years in 2016 to 38.8 years in 2022. And the average age in all counties also increased. Fingal, Kildare and Meath continued to be the counties with the youngest age on average, and Mayo, Kerry, Roscommon and Leitrim had the oldest average ages. The county recording the largest growth in average age was Kildare. Its average age rose by 2 years. The collection of date of birth allows us to look at the age profile of the population, and we can see how age cohorts change over time. In 2022, we can see evidence of an ageing population. Our older age groups grew in size while the younger ones declined. The highest increases in population numbers were seen among the over 70s, while there was a 7% fall in the number of people under 10 years of age and a 4% fall in the number of people aged 25 to 39 years. Looking now at average household size and marital status. The average household size is the number of people in private dwellings as a proportion of the number of occupied dwellings. In 2022, the average household size was 2.74 people in private occupied dwellings. In 2016, this was 2.75. In the previous census in 2011, this was 2.73. Average household size differed across counties and ranged from the lowest in Dublin City at 2.48 to 3.02 in Fingal and Meath. Average household sizes were generally higher in the east and lower in the west. Looking now at marital status, the percentage of people aged 15 years and older who were single increased by from 41% in 2016 to 43% in 2022. And in this group, there were more males than females. Married people, including civil partnerships, decreased from 48% in 2016 to 46% in 2022. And within this group, there was an equal proportion of males and females. Those identifying as separated or divorced remained stable at 6%, and in this group, there were more females than males. Recall also the voluntary completion of the time capsule that was included in the Census 2022 form. Respondents had the opportunity to include a message on the form. The CSO can report that almost 350,000 forms included some form of message on their household form. We will not publish any information from the time capsule, but will retain them in secure storage with the census forms for 100 years until they can be released in 21-22. A question on general health was first collected in 2011 census. The percentage of people reporting general health status as either very good or good was 83% in 2022. And this is down from from very good or good, which is down from 87% in 2016. Between 2016 and 22, all age groups under 75 reported a change from good to less good health. And by comparison, there were some small increases in the age groups over 75 from good to very good health between 2016 and 2022. A question on smoking tobacco products was included for the first time in an Irish census in 2022. And our results show that almost 80% of the population either never smoked or had given up smoking. And a further 13% smoked daily or occasionally. There was a higher prevalence of both daily and occasional smoking among people in their 20s and 30s. And the age group with the highest proportion of people smoking were the 25 to 29-year-olds. Smoking was more prevalent among males at 15% than females at 11% in all age groups, and this was seen in both daily and occasional smokers. In 2022, the two questions on long-lasting conditions and difficulties were revised. It included 3 overall measures of disability, and it is different to the 2016 questions in this area and is not comparable with the 2016 results. People who experienced a long-lasting condition or difficulty, we saw 22% of the population indicate that they had a condition or difficulty to any extent, and this was made up of 14 indicated that they had a condition or difficulty to some extent, while 8% had a condition or difficulty to a great extent. A question on whether children attended childcare, the type of facility they attended, and the weekly hours they attended was asked for the first time in 2022. And our results showed that just under 1 in 3 children less than 15 years were in childcare. The most common type of childcare used was a creche or a similar facility, and the second most common type of childcare was provided by an unpaid relative or family member. Looking at childcare by age groups, you can see that creches were the facilities most likely to be used by children aged 3 to 4, and older children aged 9 to 14 years were more likely to be minded by an unpaid relative or family member. The hours of childcare used differed across age groups. Younger children in childcare tended to spend more hours per week than older preschool and school-aged children. Older children in primary school were most likely to attend childcare for up to 10 hours per week. Moving on to some areas of migration and diversity. If we look at the broad categories of citizenship, we can see that 84% of the population identified as Irish and 12% as non-Irish. Of the non-Irish population usually resident in Ireland, the largest group were Polish, UK, followed by India, country of citizenship as India, Romania and Lithuania. The question on nationality changed in Census 2022 to capture information on country of citizenship, and this change may have impacted comparisons with previous census data. In 2016, 87% of the usually resident population were Irish and 11% were non-Irish. Of the 84% of Irish citizens, 81% identified as Irish only and 3% as dual Irish. In the dual Irish category, we identify 170,000 people identified themselves as dual Irish, which is a 63% increase from 2016. The largest groups of dual Irish citizens were Irish UK, American, Polish and Australian. 63% of those recording citizenship of dual Irish were born outside Ireland. The proportions of dual Irish born inside or outside of Ireland can vary across the dual citizenship categories. For example, as we can see in the chart, a much larger proportion of Irish UK citizens were born outside Ireland when compared to the Irish American, Polish and Australians, where they were more balanced at around 50-50 split up for born inside or outside of Ireland. So the question on religion has been on the census for many years and allows us to examine various religions that the people living in Ireland identify with. There was a fall in the proportion of usually resident population who identified as Roman Catholic, down from 79% in 2016 to 69% in 2022. The no religion category increased from 10% in 16 to 14% in 22. Church of Ireland showed little change but remained the largest religious category in 2022, with 125,000 people identifying as Church of Ireland. When we use these data, we can also see some of the faster growing religions, and in 2022 these were Hindu and Christian Orthodox. Looking at religion by county, Mayo recorded the highest percentage of Roman Catholics at 80%, while Dublin City recorded the lowest at 53%. I'll now pass you over to Brendan Murphy, who will present the second section of the summary results.
This section will look at some of the findings about employment, commuting, the Irish language and home ownership. These findings and some additional topics are covered in more detail in the publication. Principal economic status in the census measures whether people are at work, unemployed or not in the labour force. The share of the population at work has been increasing since 2011, with a corresponding decrease in unemployment. Combining the people at work and the unemployed, we can see the share of the population in the labour force. This has increased steadily over 30 years between 1986 and 2006. And since 2006, the proportion of the population in the labour force has fallen slightly. So what has been driving these changes? We can see that just over 1 in 10 people aged 15 and over are students, and this has stayed relatively constant over recent censuses. We can see there's been a big change in the share of the population looking after the home or family, down from 26% in 1986 to under 7% in 2022, as the number of women in the workforce increases. Also, we are seeing a rise in the proportion of retired people, doubling from 8% of the population in 1986 to 16% of the population in 2022. So more recently, the increase in women entering the labour force has been offset by increases in the share of the retired population. So we've seen an increase in the number of people at work, and we can further look at what sectors of the economy have seen the largest changes. Employment in manufacturing was up 21% between 16 and 22. The number of people working in the construction industry stood at nearly 135,000, up 32%. In the information and communications activities sector, which would include many tech companies, and in the professional, scientific and technical activity sector, which would include firms in accountancy, law and engineering, for example, employment was up 39%. Public administration and defence was one of the few sectors that saw a drop in employment between 2011 and 2016 censuses, but then grew by 23% to almost 130,000 between the 16 and human health and social work activities was the second largest sector with almost 270,000 people in employment and saw the largest absolute increase of nearly 46,000 since 2016. In 2022, a new question was asked on the census form about whether people ever worked from home. Nearly 750,000 people, a third of workers, indicated they worked from home for at least some part of their week. We can see that the rates of working from home varies by occupation. 4 to 5 business, media and public service professionals were availing of home working. That would include legal professionals and accountants, for example. The proportion of workers in the science, research, engineering and technology professionals group who ever worked from home was also high at 78%. So that would include IT specialists, programmers and so on. Workers at elementary administration and service occupations were the least likely to ever work from home at just 3%. This group would include postal sorters, couriers and cleaners, for example. So for the first time, the census asked workers whether they were at work on a full-time or part-time basis. Overall, 75% of workers responded that they worked full-time. The 3 occupational groups where workers were most likely to be part-time were secretarial occupations, such as receptionists and typists, workers in personal and leisure services, such as hairdressers and beauticians and cleaners, and sales occupations, such as cashiers. The occupational groups where workers were least likely to be part-time included professionals and associate professionals in science, engineering and technology, where over 90% of workers were full-time, and also protective service occupations such as Gardaí and prison officers. The census questions on commuting give insight into how and when people travel to their place of work, school, college and childcare. Of course, the pandemic has had a big impact on working patterns and commuting, and this data gives us a snapshot of the situation in April last year. The number of people who drove to work increased by 4% to 1.2 million between 2016 and 2022, bearing in mind that the number of people at work increased by 16% over the same period. A big increase was recorded in the number of people who work mainly at or from home, up 173% to nearly 260,000. There were 4% fewer people commuting to work by train, Lewis or Dart, but we did see a large number of people working from home in areas such as Dunleary Rathdown. Fewer third-level students commuted to their place of education on foot or by bike, but more were using public transport and cars. So while the main form of transport for school children remains the car, and while the actual number of children cycling to school was relatively small in the census, there were 88% more primary school age children cycling to school than in 2016, and the number of secondary school age children cycling to school was up 79%. The question on Irish language ability continues to provide important data on how many people can speak Irish, how often they use it, and which areas of the country it is most prevalent. The number of people who indicated they could speak Irish increased by 6% between 2016 and 2022 to 1.87 million. There were 72,000 people speaking Irish daily outside of the education system. This is a fall of 1,800 on the 2016 figure, down 2%. A new part to the question on how well Irish is spoken, a new part was added to the question in this census on how well Irish is spoken, and this chart shows that young adults are most likely to be able to speak Irish very well. So we are currently analysing data on the total housing stock, looking at unoccupied and vacant dwellings, and we will publish those results in July. But there's a lot of other data captured on housing in the census last year. People were asked questions about several aspects of their home, including whether they owned it or were renting. So we can see the proportion of owner-occupied dwellings continued to fall, down from almost 70% to 66% in the 11 years between 16 and 22. The average weekly rent paid in properties rented from a private landlord has gone from just under €200 to €273 per week in 6 years to 2022, up 37%. Data on the year a property was built is only available for dwellings that were occupied on census night and is completed by the householder. Of the occupied housing stock, over 140,000 were reported to be built between 2011 and 2022. And this slide compares some of the newer dwellings that were built between 16 and 22 to older dwellings that were built before then. We can see that older dwellings were slightly more likely to be owner-occupied. However, newer dwellings are much more likely to be owned with a mortgage. And you can see there 52% of dwellings built in the 6 years were owned with a mortgage. Also, newer dwellings were more likely to be rented from local authorities, 13% versus 8% of older dwellings. And just over 6% of newer dwellings were rented from a voluntary or cooperative body, compared to 1% of older dwellings. A question about renewable energy sources was asked for the first time in the census. Nearly a quarter of households reported that they use renewable energy sources. In older houses, wood was the most common renewable energy source. However, looking at newer dwellings built from 2016 on, we can see 70% used at least one renewable energy source. And heat pumps and solar panels were the main sources of renewable energy for these newer dwellings. Overall, the use of solar panels was reported by 6% of households. As we can see in this map, this ranged from 3% of households in Dublin City to 11% of households in Meath. Now I'll hand you back over to Cormac to wrap up.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, Sheila, for the run-through of the results. Just before we wrap up the presentation, we'd just like to share with you the publication schedule for the rest of the year. So as I mentioned at the outset, we've 8 detailed summary or thematic publications to follow, where we're going to dig into the data. You'll appreciate there's a vast amount of data that's collected as part of the census, and we'll be spending the rest of the year analysing that data to facilitate the production of these releases. I'd just like to bring your attention to the next publication that we'll be releasing, which is at the end of June, on population distribution and movement, for the reason that we'll be introducing a new definition of towns, a new census geography that we'll be introducing as part of that release. There will be more information made available on our website in advance of that publication. So just to wrap up, you'll appreciate there's a huge amount of information we presented today, and it's a bit of a fool's errand to try and boil it down into snappy talking points, but I'll try and do that anyway. The word that kind of jumps out to me is growing. So the population is growing. It's increased by 8% to over 5 million since 2016. It's growing older. The average age of the population has increased from just over 37 years in 2016 to nearly 39 years in 2022. And it's growing more diverse. So we've seen an increase of the proportion of the population who indicate that they had non-Irish citizenship from 11% in 2016 to 12% in this census. 1 in 5 of the population were born outside of Ireland, and nearly 750,000 people indicate that they could speak a language other than Irish and English at home. So that's a very brief snapshot, but obviously there's a huge amount of information there that we've thrown at you to digest. But we'll bring the presentation part of the conference to the end at that point.